Long ago, the galaxy buried the monsters they feared most. But some ghosts don't stay buried. Humanity has returned, and this time, they didn't come to conquer. They came to judge. Before we dive in, make sure you're strapped in for this one. If you love stories about unstoppable underdogs, brutal revenge, and the fall of tyrants, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens when humanity comes back from the grave. Out in the endless dark, the constellations carried whispers, fragments of tales about lost dynasties, ancient powers that had burned bright and died out long before any mortal eye had dared to map the stars. Scattered across the cosmic sea, 1,000 intelligent kin flourished, each weaving its own chronicles of triumph and ruin. Yet among all these sagas, one rumor lingered like a shadow, a myth so chilling it was smothered whenever it resurfaced. They spoke of the HFY, being so ferocious, so relentless in their rise to dominance, that the old civilizations had scoured every trace of them from the annals of history. Some storytellers murmured that the HFY turned on each other, tearing their own worlds apart in a storm of final wars. Others swore they had simply slipped beyond the rim of mapped space, carried by engines that devoured light itself, leaving only dread in their wake. Generations passed, and this legend dimmed to a bedtime terror. A half-remembered lesson spun to keep infant species cautious. How could such monsters be real? Surely, if they ever had been, they were nothing but ashes scattered among dead stars, until the horizon flickered with engines not seen for eons. The sovereignty of Vaker, rulers of half a spiral arm, had not known defeat in millennia. Their fleets carved through systems like a surgeon's blade, perfect, unchallenged, superior. So when distant sensors pinged an intruder along their border, they assumed it was some drifting refugee convoy or a band of pirates doomed to become target practice. A lone juggernaut, the Boreal Crest, was dispatched to erase the nuisance. But when the Vaker crews glimpsed those battered iron leviathans, jagged and scarred from ancient wars, they laughed. Primitive wrecks, they scoffed, until the static came alive with a voice and a dead tongue. We are the HFY. Yield or be obliterated. And with that final transmission, the myths rose again, hungry for the stars. Laughable, they said, antique weapons, ancient hulls patched together with scrap and stubbornness. And yet, when the first Vaker cruiser fell silent, its armor torn to ribbons by a hurricane of kinetic darts, that laughter curdled in their throats. Another battle barge bloomed into an expanding inferno as a relic warhead, older than any current fleet captain, punched straight through it hard. Even the Boreal Crest, pride of the Sovereignty's armada, barely managed to squawk out a dying, distressed pulse before its bridge dissolved under a storm of rail cannons. An hour, that's all it took. Not a single HFY vessel was lost to the void. Rumors ignited like a dry forest in high winds. The myth was alive. The monsters, long thought to be cosmic folklore, had come roaring back, and they wanted blood. In a panic, the Vaker mustered colossal reinforcements. More warships, heavier dreadnoughts, planet killer formations. But none of it mattered. The HFY tore through every blockade, each engagement a masterclass in raw, unhinged savagery paired with an intellect that twisted the rules of war. These were strategies no sovereignty tactician had ever studied, maneuvers born from centuries of self-inflicted apocalypse. They sent no envoys. They offered no surrender terms. They wanted restitution, vengeance for atrocities buried beneath centuries of silence, retribution for the attempt to erase them from existence. And so, as suns flared and worlds fell under ghostly shadows, one message echoed from the drifting husks of every Vaker fleet that dared oppose them. The HFY have returned. In the throne chambers of the once proud sovereignty, a new word took root in the minds of its rulers: fear. Reports flooded the citadels, each more catastrophic than the last. Entire armadas turned to debris. Colonies snuffed out like candles in a storm. What was once an empire without challengers now buckled under an onslaught they had mocked as superstition. Within the imperial bastion, high sovereign quarrels paced before trembling admirals and counselors. Holograms danced before him, Scenes of Ashgai warbringers slashing through defenses like predators through prey. This cannot stand, hissed Admiral Tyrannes, mandibles clicking in disbelief. Their ships are relics. Their technology primitive. Why do they crush us so? Quaros glared at Seer Kalen, a pallid, hooded figure whose hands tremored above her data slate. What have you found? He demanded. Kalen swallowed. Truthfully, very little, Exalted One. The records were burned long ago. Fragments say they were unyielding, merciless. But this, she gestured to the carnage glowing before them. This is beyond our darkest prophecies. A grizzled general's voice cracked the silence. What if they never died? What if they hid, reforged in secret, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim what was theirs? A chill scraped down every spine in the chamber. For an instant, they glimpsed the true horror. The Ashgai had not vanished. They had been sharpening their knives in the dark. Quaros slammed a gauntlet onto the console. Speculation is for the dead. Tell me how we break them. No one spoke. Silence hung heavy in the Sovereign Bastion's war chamber, a silence so thick it smothered every proud boast a Vaker once clung to. They had fought rebels, insurgent worlds, rival dominions, even marauding war clans. All those battles had lines, unspoken codes that both sides respected. But the Ashgai, they spat on those rules. They struck from the dark, dismantled supply chains, set munitions depots ablaze, poison fuel reserves, all without the slightest flicker of mercy. They did not parley. They did not bargain. They did not accept surrender. To them, this was no border skirmish. It was extinction or domination. Total war. A concept of sovereignty had only studied in dusty archives. And worst of all, the Ashgai were multiplying. The first Ghost Fleet had been modest, ragged leviathans armed to the teeth. But now, new war barges and strike ships emerged like phantoms every cycle. Where did they forge these engines of annihilation? How had they hidden this colossal industry? In the deep. The Sovereignty's covert operatives had no answers, which only stoked the flames of dread. Then came the blow that shattered all illusions. The Ashgai didn't just raid, they occupied. The industrial fortress world of Cryos. 9 fell in less than a week. Once thought unassailable, its planetary batteries and orbital rings crumbled before waves of Ashgai stormtroopers clad in armored exosuits that shimmered like liquid night. Witnesses spoke of soldiers who ghosted through city streets, erasing entire garrisons without leaving a single Vaker soldier to crawl back and warn the others. Cryos, 9 burned for days, its metal spires crumbling in storms of fire and ash. And when the last ember died, the banner of the Ashgai rose high above the ruins, a new dominion forging itself from the bones of the old. Fear infected every tier of the sovereignty. If Cryos, 9 could fall, any world could. Reports swarmed in strike fleets carving deeper and deeper into once unshakable borders. Worlds that had worn the sovereignty's sigil for generations now flickered in the dark under the Ashkai's shadow. High Sovereign Quaros could not pretend any longer. This was no myth come alive. It was the end of their age. Piece by piece, their empire was being consumed. He summoned the Grand Conclave, the mightiest minds and war masters of Vaker could muster. The Council Hall, once a sanctuary of dominion and pride, now shuddered with raw panic. We must unleash our Titan-class dreadnoughts, barked Marshal Torvin, plates of his armor rattling with rage. Let the Ashgai face true sovereignty firepower. Kalen, her face pale as star ice, shook her head. They're gone, she said hoarsely. Every Titan we dispatched was torn apart. A tide of disbelief swept the chamber. Quaro's voice was poison. How? Kalen drew a trembling breath. We misjudged them. Their relic ships mask horrors we never foresaw. They've twisted old tech into something that makes a mockery of our strongest shields. They know how to slip past everything we built. Our fortresses should be unbreachable, hissed Counselor Varric, mandibles twitching with disbelief. How do these primitives tear through our shielding like parchment? Seer Kalen's eyes flicked nervously across the flickering hollow maps of lost worlds. They've reshaped ancient tech in ways we never foresaw, piercing our strongest barriers like they're nothing but mist. And their tactics, she swallowed. We've never faced anything like this. What is it they crave? Barked Elder Mailer, his voice brittle with desperation. Kalen hesitated, a single word curdling on her tongue before she forced it out. Vengeance. The words seemed to suck the air from the chamber, a hush so deep that when the shouting finally erupted, it felt like a dam breaking. Madness. We are the sovereignty, snarled General Tarvek. We can broker peace. We can reason with them. No. Quorro's voice cleaved through the uproar like a blade. They will not parley. They will not halt until our kind are but shadows and dust. His scaled hand rose, silencing all dissent. A spark of ancient pride flickered in his reptilian gaze. So if it's blood they thirst for, let them learn why the Vaker have reigned supreme for 1,000 cycles. We'll scour their nests, torch their cradle worlds, and shatter every last relic of their brood. But the bravado tasted like ashes. Deep inside, Quorros felt a crack in his empire's bedrock. They had always won because their enemies had always feared them. But the Ashkai were beyond fear. For them, this was no conquest for resources or glory. This was raw, soul-deep retribution. And far beyond the mapped void, something new stirred. Forge worlds lost amid flickered back to life. Monstrous shipyards belching out hulls older than any sovereignty star chart. Humanity had returned, and they were far from finished. Across Vaker space, the Great War engine rumbled awake. Factories spat out dreadnoughts like seeds on the wind. Recruitment offices overflowed as trillions were drafted, pumped full of zeal and half-truths about the Ashkai threat. But this was no insurgency or pirate rabble. This was an enemy that rewrote every rule of engagement. The sovereignty clung to precision, to calculated moves, to doctrines polished over eons. The Ashkai wielded chaos like an artist with a brush. A single wolf pack of their raiders could appear from nowhere, gut a supply convoy, and vanish before the Vaker could scramble a response. Their ships didn't just fly, they hunted. Every strike fell where it would bleed the most. Fuel caches, repair yards, food convoys. And when they hit the ground, they were monsters of flesh and metal. The Vaker once laughed off the fall of Cryos. 9 is a fluke. But when Fort Etris and the Citadel world of Drawn fell within days, the laughter died for good. Vaker soldiers were raised to guide drones and machines from far behind the front. Bloodless war by remote command. But the Ashkai, they fought with the ground turned to broken bone, in bombed-out streets and scorched forests face to face. They were not just soldiers. They were the blades. Horror rippled through the sovereignty's legions as they faced a truth they were never trained to understand. Ashkai shock troopers did not crumble when cornered. They only grew more ferocious. Encirclement, superior numbers. These meant nothing. They fought like predators unchained, with a reckless cunning that made no sense until your battalion lay in pieces at their feet. The worst were the void-born strikers, the Ashkai's elite. They didn't just kill Vaker soldiers. They hunted them for sport. They mapped every weakness in real time, twisting tactics faster than any sovereignty commander could counter. A single strike team could erase an entire outpost overnight, leaving only the echo of spent kinetic slugs and broken armor. Primitive weapons. The Vaker had scoffed, but those metal rounds punched through advanced plating as if it were brittle glass. And the way they wielded them. No mercy, no quarter. That terrified the Dominion more than the losses. The Ashkai weren't conquering these worlds. They were reclaiming them. Desperation gripped the highest ranks like a tightening noose. The Vaker were rulers by birthright, the uncontested architects of order for countless generations. Why, they asked behind closed doors, did they deserve the storm of ruin? And then Supreme Sovereign Quorros unearthed the rot festering in their foundations. In the bowels of the Forbidden Archive, vault sealed since the dawn of their reign, he found what centuries of propaganda had buried. The Ashkai had not simply faded into myth. They had been erased, scoured from existence by the sovereignty's own ancestors. Back when humanity was young and blazing outward at a pace that routed the old empires, they had built coalitions, mastered warcraft faster than any starfaring kin. They weren't monsters, they were unstoppable. And so the Vaker progenitors made a monstrous choice. They launched the harvest purges. Entire human worlds turned to cinders. Colonies salted with nuclear fire. Survivors hunted to the farthest drift of the spiral arms, until the Dominion's elders were certain no ember remained. But the ember had not died. It had burned deep in the dark, fed by centuries of rage and grief. Now, those children of genocide have returned, not as marauders hungry for new dominion, but as executioners delivering an ancient verdict. The revelation cracked Koros to his bones. He stood alone in the echoing archive vault, the flickering holos of burning cities reflected in his obsidian eyes. Faces of his forebears glared down at him from the shadows, the architect of an atrocity so vast that its echoes had crossed centuries to kill them now. The Ashkai had every reason to hate. But as he replayed the last transmission from a void, the cold calm in their final ultimatum, Koros knew this wasn't hate. Hate could be reasoned with. This was older. This was colder. This was something far worse. Retribution. The word crawled across Koros' mind like a blade of ice. The vaulted silence of the archive shattered when a shrill chime cut through the gloom. A crimson transmission sigil flickered to life above the council dais. Admiral Tirani's face bled into view, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and raw terror. "They're here!" Tirani's rasped, voice hollow as a tomb. Koros straightened, his scales tightening across his jaw. "Where?" Tirani swallowed. "Here, on Var Prime." A hush. It struck the assembled warlords like a thunderclap. Impossible. The Ashkai were still hammering the outer systems. They shouldn't have been able to breach the sovereignty's heart so soon. But they had. A klaxon screamed. Tactical holos unfurled across the war bastion, clusters of blood-red sigils streaking down from orbit, each one a harbinger of death. Ashkai war behemoths, larger, more vicious than any the sovereignty's admirals had dared to imagine, slipped past the outer pickets as though they didn't exist. They weren't here for another battle. They were here to close the ledger. The skies above Var Prime burned crimson as the first Ashkai drop barges clawed through the stratosphere. Anti-air batteries spat fire into the void, but the Ashkai had come prepared. Infiltration units had already ghosted aboard orbital fortresses, turning the sovereignty's own defense cannons on their fleets. Vaker dreadnoughts detonated in low orbit, molten wreckage raining onto the shining spires below. In the streets, horror erupted like a plague. Citizens fled through flame-lit avenues, their once unchallenged empire dissolving before their eyes. Vaker troops, raised to believe in their genetic supremacy, froze as Ashkai shock teams stalked from the shadows. They fought like nightmares, merciless, silent, surgical. They wasted nothing, striking power grids, data nexuses, and command bunkers first. Within hours, entire sectors drowned in darkness. Koros watched it unfold from his iron throne, his generals barking contradictory orders, voices cracking under the weight of their own extinction. None of it mattered. The sovereignty wasn't losing. It had already lost. One final card remained. Koros' voice came out like a death knell. Prepare the orbital purge. Wipe this world from the stars, if we must. The chamber froze. Even his closest commanders recoiled. Chancellor Saran, her skin pale as dead stone, managed to whisper, "High Sovereign, that will obliterate billions, our own people." Koros' eyes glowed with cold finality. "Then so be it. If we can't hold Var Prime, neither will they." But before the order could take form, the great adamant doors of the war bastion shuddered and swung inward. A figure stepped through, flanked by two Ashkai warriors clad in shadow-black exosuits. Koros knew that face, not from life, but from forbidden reels buried deep in the archive. one of the last children of the Cinders, a descendant of the slaughtered. Ashkai, no human, and the human had come to collect the debt. He stepped forward, helmet tucked beneath his arm, eyes not brimming with hatred, but something infinitely colder, absolute certainty. Sovereign Koros clenched his jaw, talons digging into the armrest of his shattered throne. "What do you want?" he hissed. The human's smile was almost gentle. "Balance." Beyond the chamber's sundered walls, Vara Prime burned. In a single night, the sovereignty, an empire that had been half a galaxy beneath its boot for millennia, crumbled into ash. Their vaunted fleets, their unbreakable citadels, their armor of fear and supremacy, all proved worthless. The Ashkai had not arrived to bargain or annex. They did not come to raise a new banner over old chains. They were the executioner's blade, delivering a sentence decreed by forgotten ghosts. There would be no councils, no last-minute truce. Dawn came in silence. The sovereignty's high command lay dead. Koros, his admirals, the architects of oblivion, gone without ceremony. The Ashkai offered no words of pity, no mercy. The verdict had been centuries old. This was the final swing of the axe. When the smoke settled, Vara Prime stood eerily still. The mighty sky-piercing spires, one symbols of dominion grandeur, lay fractured, weeping trails of black smoke into a red dawn. The banners of the Vaker lay shredded beneath the boots of the risen dead, and from a highest tower a new standard fluttered, the sigil of humanity, reborn in vengeance and iron. Across every surviving sovereignty world, the same transmission flickered to life. A single Ashkai commander stood before the feed, his battered armor soaked in the grime of 1,000 battlefields, eyes hollow but steady. No triumph curled his lips, only the cold weight of finality. "The Vaker's sovereignty is no more," he said, each word echoing across crumbling cities and trembling bunkers. "Your tyrants are dead. Your armadas lie scattered among the stars. The empire that bled our people dry has fallen. A breath, heavy as the void. You ruled by fear. You tried to cut us from time itself. But still we stand." He leaned closer, voice sharpened to a blade. "Humanity does not forget. Humanity does not forgive. But we do understand justice." The feed flickered. Lines of Dominion soldiers, those who surrendered without bloodshed, marched away in chains under Ashkai guard. They had not been erased, not all of them. The innocent would be spared, but they would never command again. "We do not wish to become your new masters," the commander finished. "We have reclaimed what was stolen. The rest is yours to decide. May you choose wisely." And so an age ended, one empire's fall rippling across the void. Some worlds wept for freedom, some fractured into chaos. Powers rose to fill the emptiness, but none dared test the Ashkai, for now the stars knew an unyielding truth. Humanity had outlived its extinction. The stars had always kept their secrets, whispers of vanished kingdoms and lost empires that crumbled long before the first human ever dared to look up and dream. Across the boundless expanse, 1,000 species flourished, each with its own tapestry of triumphs, betrayals, and legends too dark to speak aloud. But among all those myths, one tale flickered like a ghost fire in forgotten vaults and secret conclaves. Humanity. They spoke of them as a race forged in ruin, unstoppable in their hunger, insatiable in their conquests, so ferocious, so untamed, that the elder races of the Spiral Accord had made a pact to scour them from time itself, records obliterated, names stricken from star maps. Some claimed they'd turn on each other, devoured by their own weapons in an apocalypse of ash. Others believed they fled beyond the rim, into the deep dark where no empire dared chase. Yet their memory lingered, not as heroes or devils, but as a warning, a spectral reminder of what ambition unchained could summon. For centuries the rumor waned, buried beneath the certainties of new dynasties. The grand empires mocked it as old bedtime poison, a ghost story to frighten hatchlings and younglings too curious for their own good. If such monsters had ever breathed, They were nothing but cosmic dust now. And then the day came when a fleet drifted back from oblivion. The sovereignty of Rael, mightiest among the elder dominions, had known no rival for millennia. Its dominion webbed across hundreds of systems, its war minds generations ahead of any who dared defy them. So when a deep space picket flagged an anomaly on the edge of their border, they assumed it was a derelict, some lost pilgrim ship or scavenger clan about to learn a fatal lesson. They dispatched a single dread barge, the Valish, its crew brimming with the arrogance of a people untouched by true fear. When they beheld the approaching vessels, slabs of ancient metal bristling with crude rail batteries, and armored plating scarred from battles long unremembered, they laughed. These ships were relics, forged for function, not beauty, ruins that should have drifted in scrapyards. They opened hails with smug delight, the brashness of a species that had never tasted loss. But the reply that hissed across their comms was in a tongue their archivists had buried under 1,000 locks. "We are the HFY. Stand down or be erased." The dread barge admiral sneered. "HFY. Myths. Extinct." Yet the scanners told another story. These battered hulls move with terrifying synchrony. Fire control grids warmed with the hum of ancient gods awakening. He stifled the tremor coiling in his gut. A single order. Annihilation. It would be his last command. The HFY warships lunged forward, slipping between plasma volleys like phantoms reborn. Their ancient weapons, crude by sovereignty standards, should have been laughable, but they weren't. The first dreadnought went dark in seconds, its shielding shredded by a storm of hyper-accelerated slugs. Another blossomed into fire as an obsolete missile speared at heart. One more dread barge died screaming, a streak of ancient but merciless ordnance cracking its armored spine. The Sovereignty's pride, the Celestis, crown jewel of their war fleets, didn't even manage to spit out a full distress burst before its bridge exploded in a rain of superheated alloy. The battle was over in less than an hour. Not a single HFY hull lost to the void. Word leapt from star to star like wildfire drenched in oil. The unthinkable had happened. The old nightmares were real. The HFY, the monsters expunged from history, had returned, and they were not here to parley. Panic rattled through the Sovereignty's veins. They launched everything, patrol wings, entire armadas stitched together in frantic haste. It didn't matter. The HFY tore through them like wolves through sheep. They fought with savagery and cunning that shredded every doctrine the Vaker had clung to for ages. There were no surrender talks, no envoys, no demands for tribute. Only ruin, a reckoning for sins the galaxy had tried to bury under centuries of silence. As entire planets flickered into flame and the stars themselves seemed to weep, one message scrawled itself across the void, inked in the drifting wreckage of every Sovereignty warship left to drift and bleed. The HFY returned. In the Sovereignty's black marble bastion, High Sovereign Koros stood like a statue carved from ice. Around him, his senior warlords and strategists gathered in a ring of flickering holos. Each projection told the same tale. HFY raiders striking deep, vanishing before counterstrikes have formed, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. "This cannot be," hissed Admiral Tarnek, his scaled mandibles twitching with barely checked terror. "They're ghosts, relics. Their warframes are antiques. Their engines should be dust. How are they slaughtering us?" Koros turned his cold eyes to Siren, his chief archivist, pale scales glistening with cold sweat. "What did your vaults hide from us?" Siren swallowed. Her hands shook over the hologram controls. "Not much, Sovereign. The chronicles were erased generations ago. What scraps survived say they were relentless, endlessly adaptive. But this," she gestured helplessly at the cascade of fallen fleets, "this is beyond anything we prepared for." A low, hoarse voice cut through the chamber. General Auric, grizzled, old enough to remember the tales told in secret, leaned forward. "What if they were never gone?" he rasped. "What if they'd been out there, in the dark, building, waiting for the hour to strike?" A hush spread like frost. The notion of the Ashgai not just surviving, but brooding in the abyss, sharpening their vengeance for centuries, that truth was worse than any fleet or cannon. Enough ghosts and shadows, Koros growled, his claws scraping iron grooves into the armrest. How do we stop them? Silence. Nothing but the cold hiss of failing data feeds. The Vaker had fought rebels, brigands, rival dominions. But nothing like this. Nothing that refused every rule they had ever written. And somewhere in the void, the storm kept growing. But unlike all the enemies that had come before, rebels, pirates, rival sovereignties, the Ashgai refused to play by any rulebook the Vaker had ever known. Every enemy before them had honored the unspoken codes. Formal declarations, clear battle lines, the chance for surrender. The Ashgai spat on all of it. They struck without warning, without mercy, and never offered quarter. They didn't bother posturing over territory or parleying for concessions. Instead, they carved the sovereignty open from within, ripping out supply convoys, gutting shipyards, torching fuel refineries. They waged war not as an art, but as an extinction event, the kind the Vaker had never even imagined. And worse still, they were multiplying. The first Ashgai spearhead had been small, just enough to burn a few outposts. But now, new warships were appearing daily. Hulking shadows with old bones but terrifying new teeth. Where were these iron phantoms coming from? How had they built entire strike fleets, while the Vaker spies were blind? That question, unanswered, was what truly gnawed at the sovereignty's sanity. Then came the moment that turned dread into horror. The Ashgai didn't just raid and vanish. They took their first world. The sovereignty had scoffed when rumors came in. The Ashgai were little more than raiders, scavengers with a grudge. But when the industrial fortress world of Chorus, 9 fell, every lie they clung to turned to ash. Survivors spoke of nightmare infantry, soldiers clad in iron exoframes, stalking through factories like ghosts made of steel and gunfire. No Dominion trooper was left breathing. Entire cityscapes burned for weeks, until the smoke parted just long enough to reveal a new flag. The Ashgai sigil, black and white over smoldering ruins. A message carved in flame. They were here not merely for vengeance, but to rebuild something the stars had tried to erase. Panic rippled outward like a shockwave. Chorus, 9 was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, reports flooded Koros chambers, planets, some untouched by war for centuries, now bled under the Ashkai's iron heel. They moved fast, systematic, precise. A new dominion was growing in the ashes of the old. High Sovereign Koros had no choice. He summoned the Grand Conclave, the Empire's iron circle of warlords, strategists, and planetary barons. A chamber once drenched in ceremony now reeked of fear and sweat. "We must deploy the arc shields," barked Admiral Taurusneck, voice cracking with strain. "Their raiding packs are vicious, but they can't match the might of our capital dread forges." "They already have," Siren countered, her pale scales trembling. "We launched 3 arc shields at Chorus 9. They were incinerated." A hiss of disbelief slithered around the table. Koro's eyes narrowed to slits. "How?" he growled. Siren's hands fluttered over shifting holos. "We underestimated them. Their ships look ancient, but their weapon cores have mutated. They slipped past our shielding arrays. Their battle doctrine, it's nothing we've ever..." She faltered. The screens flickered with ruin, and every eye knew the truth. They were not just losing, they were unraveling. "What do they even want?" One of the counselors croaked, voice brittle as frost. Siren's eyes darted across the swirling projections. Burning worlds, crippled dread forges, endless ruin. Her words slipped out like a blade unsheathed. "Retribution." Silence. Then the chamber erupted. A storm of fear disguised as fury. "This is insanity. We are the Vaker sovereignty. We bend stars to our will. Open negotiations. No foes beyond reason. They'll bleed us dry. We must sue for truce." Koros snarl cleaved through the shouting. His reptilian gaze burned with a fury that couldn't quite mask the dread beneath. If it's vengeance they crave, then let them choke on it. Let them see why we have ruled unchallenged for 1,000 years. We will scour their worlds, hunt their spawn to the last breath. Yet even as he roared, the words echoed hollow against the cold marble. He could feel it. The truth coiled tight in his chest. The Vaker had always crushed their enemies because they'd always stood taller, stronger, better armed. But these were no ordinary foes. The Ashgai did not fear death. They had been bred in its shadow for centuries. And this war, it wasn't about territory or dominion. It was a debt, ancient and paid in blood. In the far reaches of the void, beyond the last charted systems, the Ashgai were still forging new blades. A fresh fleet gathering like a thunderstorm, each hull a promise that they were far from done. The Sovereignty's war machine howled to life in answer. Across 1,000 worlds, dry docks shrieked with the sparks of new dread barges. Conscription centers overflowed with trembling youth, eyes glassy from endless propaganda. Stories of feral Ashgai marauders who must be driven back into the dark. The Vaker had faced uprisings before. Rogue houses, rival empires that had flared and fizzled. But they had never faced anything like this. And still the Ashgai advanced. The conflict didn't play by any rules the sovereignty held sacred. They believed in order, in doctrines refined over ages, in predictability. But the Ashgai fought like wildfire. One moment they were nowhere. The next they materialized inside a convoy's throat, tearing out supply lines and surgical strikes. They never lingered. No protracted sieges, no drawn-out slugfests. They struck the nerve, ripped it out, vanished back into the dark. Then came the horror on the ground. When Chorus, 9 fell, some clung to the hope that it was a tragic anomaly. But when the industrial fortresses of Kethros, 6 and Dralin Prime were incinerated in the same week, the truth hit like a blade to the spine. This was not random. This was a pattern. The Vaker had built their armies on drones and pristine distance, their warriors comfortable, insulated behind swarms of metal. But the Ashgai, they fought in the mud and ash, iron exosuits breathing fire. They were not soldiers commanding machines. They were the machines. Unlike the Vaker, the Ashgai did not hide behind metal ghosts. They did not perch on command bridges miles above the fight, barking orders to drones that bled in their stead. They became the blade. They crawled through shattered alleyways, ducked under ruined overpasses, and turned cities into charnel houses. Vaker soldiers, so used to pristine warfare, neat, surgical, bloodless, recoiled in horror when they met the Ashgai face to face. These warriors didn't break when pinned. They didn't beg when surrounded. They fought like cornered beasts, relentless, snarling, unstoppable, until the last pulse rifle fell silent. The worst were the Ashgai marauder cadres, phantoms draped in exo-frames blacker than the abyss. They didn't simply kill sovereignty troopers. They hunted them down one by one. And they learned. Every skirmish taught them how to cut deeper next time. What started as crude slug throwers evolved into hypervelocity rounds that punched through sovereignty armor like paper husks. They were not merely seizing worlds. They were reclaiming them. Deep inside the sovereignty's heart, Koros and his inner circle ransacked the forbidden archives, desperate to answer the question that ate at them like rot. Why? They were the Vaker, undisputed overlords of the stars. What sin could possibly warrant this abyssal fury? Then they found it, tucked under centuries of sealed directives and security ciphers. A single truth, black as pitch: the Ashgai hadn't been erased by chance. They had been murdered by design. Long before the sovereignty's banner cast its shadow over 1,000 systems, they had stumbled upon humanity, young, ravenous, dazzlingly quick to master war. Not monsters, not savages, just insatiable. And so, the sovereignty's architects had made the only choice they believed would keep the future safe. They committed the unthinkable. Entire planets turned to cinders. Colonies salted to the winds. History itself purged, so not even ghosts remained. The last human survivors, scattered like seeds, were hunted to the edges of charted space. And then the Vaker had built their empire atop that graveyard, confident the sin would never claw its way back. But it had. And now, centuries later, the Ashgai stood reborn, not as conquerors, but as executioners. The revelation struck Koros harder than any blade. This war wasn't about territory or dominion or power. It was an ancient verdict come due, a blood debt that had waited lifetimes to be paid. He stood alone in the archive vault, cold light flickering across his scales. Hollow recordings of scorched human worlds played out before him. The old sovereigns who had signed the genocide decrees stared down from marble busts, their silent stone eyes mocking him. Their actions had sealed the fate of every descendant to come. The Ashgai did not hate the Vaker. Hate was too small for this. What burned in them now was older, a retribution no grave could contain. Their ancestors had carved this doom into stone long before any of them had drawn breath. The humans had every right to drown the stars in their fury. But what seethed behind those silent fleets wasn't a flicker of simple hate. No, hate was human. Hate could be soothed, reasoned with, traded away for peace. This was older, deeper. This was retribution wrapped in the cold logic of survival. A soft chime shattered the thick silence inside the sovereignty's war sanctum. A shaky hollow feed snapped to life. Admiral Kaler's gaunt face stared out, his eyes wide with disbelief barely concealed by a ceremonial mask. "They're here," he rasped, voice brittle. Koros leaned forward, clawed hands braced on the obsidian table. "Where?" Kaler's throat bobbed. "Here, Acrian Prime." For a heartbeat, the chamber turned graveyard silent. Impossible. The Ashgai were meant to be trapped in the frontier worlds, bleeding themselves dry on outer ramparts. They could not, be standing at the gates of the Vaker's capital. But they were. An alarm shrieked overhead. Tactical holoscreens sprang open like dying suns, splashed in crimson threat markers. Dozens, no hundreds, of Ashgai dreadships ghosted down from orbit, weaving past defense grids they should never have reached. These were not raiders come to skirmish. This was the blade drawn to the throat. Above Acrian Prime, the skies ignited, contrails of descending drop carriers slicing through the stratosphere like falling knives. Planetary defense guns roared awake, throwing up curtains of plasma and flak. But it was too late. The Ashgai had mapped this slaughter for centuries. Infiltration craft had already wormed into the orbital defense stations, flipping the sovereignty's own turrets inward. Vaker cruisers turned into blossoming suns in low orbit, raining blazing ruin on the very streets they once vowed to protect. On the ground, riots twisted into raw panic. Citizens who'd been raised from birth to believe they were the apex predators of the galaxy now watched their shining towers crumble like termite mounds kicked open by vengeful giants. Sovereignty troopers, once trained to chant their species' supremacy, now flinched as shapes emerged through rolling clouds of flame. The Ashgai were not soldiers. They were executioners, and they moved like wraiths through the broken districts, cutting power, slicing through command hubs, ripping the planet's spine apart in hours. In his command spire, Koros stood frozen as chaos howled around him. His lieutenants shrieked demands, contradicted orders, barked lies they no longer believed. But the sovereignty was already dead. They just hadn't admitted it yet. His last card? Oblivion itself. "Arm the scorched earth failsafe," he murmured, voice flat as iron. The chamber fell still. Even his most brutalist balked. "It will take billions with it," Savar breathed. "If we cannot rule this world," Koros said, "no one shall." But before the order could fester into reality, the war chamber's doors cracked inward. Boots echoed on marble, and in stepped the nightmare-made flesh, a human. His battle plate shone obsidian, helmet cradled under his arm, eyes burning with something colder than any blade. Koros knew him at once. A ghost dragged from buried records, one of the last heirs of slaughtered tribes. The Ashgai commander stopped just within the circle of light. His gaze held no hatred, only inevitability. Koros's mouth dried. What do you want? The human's answer was a single word, etched in iron: judgment. Certainty. That was what burned behind the human's eyes as he met Vekos' stare. Not rage, not the fragile flame of hate, but something harder, something inevitable. Vekos' jaw tightened until his fangs cut his lip. What do you want? He forced out. The human's lips curled into something too cold to be called a smile. Justice. Outside, the Dominion's grand jewel turned to cinders. Vel Prime, capital of an empire that had once been entire sectors to at will, fell in a single night. The fleets that had darkened whole star fields, the iron rule that had stood unchallenged for millennia. None of it mattered in the end. Humanity had not returned as conquerors, nor emissaries of mercy. They had come as executioners, sentence bearers for a crime that had been scoured from the Dominion's memory, but never from theirs. By dawn, the high command of the Dominion lay dead. Supreme Chancellor Vekos, his admirals, his war ministers, each one met the same silent fate. The Ash Guy offered no grand declarations, no demand for surrender, no chance for absolution. The verdict had been written in the ashes of their ancestors. Tonight was only the reckoning. When the fires finally ebbed, the spires of El Prime stood broken against the scarlet dawn. Banners that had once fluttered from every tower, symbols of Dominion supremacy, lay shredded in the streets. Above the highest ruin, a new standard snapped in the wind, the banner of humanity. Across the stars, every Dominion world, from fortress moons to farming colonies, flickered with the same transmission. A human commander stood before the camera, clad in battle-scored black armor. His face was calm, but there was nothing triumphant in his eyes, only a finality deeper than any victory speech. "The Dominion is no more," he said, voice echoing through abandoned halls and crowded streets alike. "Your leaders are gone. Your fleets lie in ruin. Your empire has fallen." He paused, as if daring the ghost to object. "For centuries, you ruled through fear. You buried our history. You tried to bury us. And yet here we stand." He leaned in, his gaze pinning the galaxy itself. Humanity does not forget. Humanity does not forgive. But we do understand justice. The broadcast shifted images of Dominion soldiers, chained, defeated, but spared. The Ash Guy had not slaughtered them all. Those who had not raised weapons, who had not spilled innocent blood, would live, but they would never rule again. "We do not come to replace you," the commander said, his word an epitaph for an empire. "We do not come to build a throne upon your bones. We have reclaimed what was stolen from us. Nothing more. The galaxy is yours to decide what comes next. Use it well or lose it." The feed died. The era ended. From the ashes of extinction, the galaxy would forever remember one truth. Humanity survived, and humanity remembers. If this tale of humanity's wrath stirred something in you, let me know in the comments. Would you stand with them or against them? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who loves a good reckoning. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, some ghosts never stay buried. They thought they'd won. They thought the void would keep their secret buried forever. But some things can't be killed, only caged. And when the last fool pried open the lock, the galaxy remembered what true fear tastes like. Listen closely, because once you know what drifts inside a Terran warship, you'll wish you'd never asked. Before we plunge into the shadows between the stars, make sure you're ready to hear the secret they swore to bury. Subscribe now. Turn on the bell and brace yourself. Because once you know what lurks inside humanity's silent warships, there's no turning back. Out in the boundless abyss between stars, countless civilizations drifted, each carving out its identity through alien ingenuity, impossible machines, and philosophies as strange as the worlds they call home. Among them rose a Dominion ascendant, a confederation of the universe's most enlightened species, proud in their talent for dissecting, cataloging, and controlling every other known kind. For centuries, they spread like wildfire, consuming entire worlds and folding their people into the ever-growing core of their might. No fleet resisted them for long, until they stumbled upon the species called humans. At first, the Dominion treated mankind like any other cosmic curiosity. They filed away the species under primitive, rapidly developing, just another upstart to monitor. The ascendant scribes noted how humans had dragged themselves, tooth and nail, off their cradle surface, first strapped to crew combustion rockets, then onto stuttering fusion drives. Their vessels lacked the elegance of the Cirrus silver sails. They knew nothing of the Zari's living ships, nor could they touch the mind-bending mental prowess of the Veil-Theory seers. And yet, something about these Terran vessels left Dominion analysts restless. Their first clash was with the archivists of Mirka, a race obsessed with knowing everything about everyone. Their vaunted intelligence nexus prided itself on piercing any hull, no matter how cunningly masked. For them, data was life. So when American scouts first brushed up against the Terran dreadship ISS Resolute, they did what they did best. They scanned. What returned defied reason. The Resolute's hull, at a glance, was mundane. Layered alloys, hardened fields, conventional plating. But the deeper their probes went, the more the feed warped into nonsense. One moment, the scan screamed fission core, then flickered into antimatter singularity, before jumping to energy signatures that didn't exist in any known lexicon. Its armaments blurred in and out of recognition. Gauss arrays and plasma lances, then monstrous weapons that seemed to slip between the cracks of physics itself. Stranger still, vast chambers inside the vessel simply ate the signals. Black voids that swallowed every pulse the Mirkin sensor spat out. Then, as if the universe itself revolted, the Dominion's entire surveillance lattice went dark. Not just the scanners pointed at the Resolute. All of it. Deep space arrays, orbital grids. Even the neural implants fused into Mirkin overseers erupted in static and shrieking code. Researchers spasmed at their posts, eyes bleeding as feedback fried their synapses. Some died before they hit the floor. Others clawed at their own faces, whimpering about a voice and machine whispering truths too vast to bear. It took the Mirka weeks to breathe life back into their networks. When they did, they decreed a single desperate edict. No Mirkin shall ever again attempt to unravel a Terran vessel. The Dominion scoffed. Surely it was just a quirk, a ghost in the hardware. But the nightmare repeated itself again and again. The Silicari, a species famed for their grown computers, living clusters of synaptic coral and bioneural strands, sent a tendril swarm to pry apart the secrets of a Terran juggernaut. The instant their organic probes touched the alien energy halo, the tendrils withered like frostbitten roots, their biomass rotting away before the Silicari scientists' horrified eyes. When the Veil-Theory seers, beings whose minds could eavesdrop on an entire planet's thoughts in a single breath, turned their gifts toward a lone Terran cruiser drifting near their border, they returned broken. Their astral senses came apart in the void, leaving only husks who babbled nonsense in pitch-black chambers, forever haunted by something they could not name. So now, out there in the churning dark, a question festers like a wound inside the Dominion Ascendant's mind. What are they truly found in this feral species called humankind? And what sleeps at the heart of those ships that the universe itself refuses to look upon, murmured about the screaming abyss they glimpsed writhing inside the hull? Even the Orikai, a race of seers who once bragged they could chart a battle's outcome before the first starship powered up its engines, found their prophetic threads unraveling the instant a Terran warship entered their visions. Instead of clear glimpses of victory or defeat, they saw only static, an endless wall of snow, or, far worse, they glimpsed themselves already lifeless in the void long before the opening salvo. The final fracture came when the Dominion Ascendant's ruling conclave demanded an all-or-nothing probe. They marshaled a united armada, bristling with the most sophisticated sensor arrays ever woven into metal and biocircuitry, and encircled a solitary Terran dreadnought, the ISS Harrow. What happened next was buried under layers of silence and sealed transcripts. What scraps remained tell a fleet that vanished as if space itself swallowed every hull, every mind, every echo. No cries for help, no scorched wreckage drifting through the black. Only absence. In the aftermath, the Ascendant declared a singular iron edict. No species, however enlightened or brazen, would ever again dare to peer inside the iron bones of a Terran vessel, because whatever secret nested in that armored darkness was never meant for any living mind to know. They tried to muzzle the rumor machine, of course. Proclamations, disinformation, polite threats. But rumor has its own gravity. Soon, the tale spread like solar fire, carried in backroom whispers and half-corrupted data fragments. All across the scattered star realms, theorists, spies, and war tacticians alike obsessed over what truly devoured those who dared to look. Some claimed humanity had unlocked a quantum veil, so profound it bent the observer's mind until it cracked. Others suggested their ships were wrapped in some alien matter that defied the law of reality itself, a trick that turned physics into rumor. But the darkest speculation arose from the veil theory, those same mind speakers who'd barely staggered back from their ill-fated psychic incursion. They told of a horror stranger than any encryption. They insisted Terran warships were not mere constructs. They were alive. Skeptics laughed for a while. But those who'd stood on a star bridge and watched the Terran vessel prowl through the dark knew better. It was in the way these behemoths pivoted on a dime, the way they anticipated volleys before they came, how they always drifted just out of the kill zone, as if they weren't piloted but rather alert, watching, calculating, waiting for a chance to strike. One people, though, the feral and audacious Vron, refused to cower behind omens. Where other species tread carefully, the Vron charged headlong. Conquest was etched into their blood. They saw every new frontier as a throat to seize. With wild pride, they rallied an armada, one of the largest battleclades ever stitched together, and set their crosshairs on a Terran bastion among the shattered asteroids of Cordane's reach. And at the black heart of that fortress drifted a lone human dreadship, the ISS Oblivion. By every measure of logic, this should have been a slaughter. The Vron spearhead outnumbered the Terran, ghosts 100 to 1. They carried doomsday lances and singularity cannons, weapons that had ripped gas giants to pieces in other wars. Their warlords were iron-blooded conquerors, tested in more campaigns than any mortal tongue could tally. But the instant they closed the gap, reality itself seemed to buckle. The Oblivion did not drift like any warship built by mortal hands. It glided through the star-churned dark with an eerie grace, slipping between barges as if it could taste the future on its armored skin. Beams meant the spirit hull found only empty space. Or worse, rebounded into Vron's own flanks, vaporizing their proudest dreadclaws in friendly fire. Then their command channels splintered into madness. Admirals roared orders down the comm lines, only to hear their own voices echo back twisted and layered with something else, something that spoke in tones not meant for ears. Some heard themselves pleading, "Run." Some heard nothing at all, just a crushing silence like the endless dark between stars. And then the screaming began. It did not come from the Terran ship's guns, no torpedoes, no visible strike. It erupted from within the Vron's own hulls. Battalions of warriors, elite pilots, battlekin tacticians. They dropped where they stood, clawed at their skulls as if trying to dig out whatever had slithered inside. No enemy fire touched them. No blast tore through their hulls. Yet they perished all the same, their minds turned inside out by something unseen and ravenous. One Vron captain, in the moments before invisible force peeled his cruiser apart like fruit skin, managed to spit out a final burst of data toward the home spire. What he uttered was dissected, hidden away, forbidden to be spoken aloud again. It was a single broken sentence. "The ship is staring at me." When the silence fell, only the Oblivion remained, drifting among the ghosts. No drifting carcasses, no twisted slag to recover. The Vron juggernaut, the greatest armada ever forged by the warriors who had ground entire sectors to dust, was simply gone, From that dark hour on, the Vron, once the galaxy's nightmares given flesh, refused to speak the dread ship's name. No ledgers marked the loss. No tombs were carved. The whole massacre sank into myth, a cold story traded in shadowed cantinas by those who still wonder what truly breathes inside a Terran hull. Yet one fact carved itself into bones of every starfaring species. Even the boldest, the fiercest, the cleverest minds would never again try to peel back the layers of a human vessel. A hush followed every Terran silhouette drifting through the void, but the hush was more than fear. It was a testament, a cosmic gravestone etched with a single warning. There are doors you do not open, eyes you do not meet. So entire empires learned to turn away their sensors, averting their arrays, as if glancing at a living paradox might poison them too. Terran ships were treated like singularities wrapped in metal, anomalies better left alone, drifting enigmas prowling the cosmic dark. And yet, there is always one who cannot resist the abyss. The Zirani, ancient, imperious, minds honed to bend the fabric of the universe until it begged for mercy. Their sages claim mastery of reality's threads, able to fold time around their thoughts and twist probability like clay. To the Zirani, the other starborn civilizations were squabbling children in the shadow of their brilliance. They bore no patience for the so-called Dominion's timid caution. To them, dread was the crutch of feeble minds. Where the Ascendant's races saw a gulf of danger, the Zirani saw a vault waiting to be cracked open. So when the fractured tails of Terran juggernauts reached their crystalline citadels, they did not flinch. They'd never stood face to face with human envoy, never clashed with them in a war zone. To the Zirani, Terrans were little more than clever brutes who had stumbled, blind and lucky, onto a prize they were unworthy to wield. Whatever secret slumbered within those black ships would be plundered and dissected. So the Zirani High Synod commissioned Operation Obsidian Veil. A single vessel, the Nixian Spear, was crafted, a masterpiece of reality tunneling arrays, draped in quantum veils so deep they drifted between dimensions like a ghost. It bore no cannons, no hull shredders, just the most ruthless suite of sensors the Zirani had ever conjured. It could read the heartbeat of a dying star if it wished. Their quarry? The ISS Eclipse, a Terran dread cruiser patrolling the far edges of human space, too far from any fleet for a quick rescue. The Nixian Spear lingered at the event horizon of distance, careful to remain unseen. No hails, no weapons primed, just cold, clinical observation. In the beginning, all was routine. Their consoles hummed with readings they'd expected. Standard hull composites, nominal thermal spikes, localized distortions in the gravimetric flux. Then they dared the final step. They powered up their deep-phase cortex scanners, the instruments meant to flay apart reality's skin. That's when the Eclipse pivoted, not with the lumbering caution of a battleship adjusting its patrol, but like a predator, an apex mind turning its gaze to meet another pair of eyes. There was no rational way the Terrans could have detected them. The Nixian Spear's veil danced outside ordinary dimensions, hidden from every known sensor. And yet, the moment they stared inward, the ship stared back. A hush crushed the bridge. For the first time in ages, every Zirani aboard felt a cold weight pressing on their immortal pride, an emotion they'd not tasted since their species learned to bend time. Dread. The lead chronarch, a being whose mind once traced the arteries of tomorrow like a sculptor's chisel, hesitated. His hand hovered above the console, paralyzed by a fear he could not translate into numbers or sigils. And then systems began to flicker. One by one, the heart of the Nixian Spear went dark. Sensors gone. Dimensional cloaks torn away. Gravity shells, life support, silent as a tomb. Panic bloomed across the command deck, shimmering skin flushing with patterns of confusion and rage. There was no sabotage, no intrusion from outside. Whatever was happening was inside their ship, not a virus, not a swarm, but a presence. The chronarch's breath caught in his throat as the walls around him seemed to dissolve. The sterile lab, the vessel's sleek corridors, all gone. He found himself standing adrift in a chasm without shape or color, a forever void that breathed around him. Voices flickered at the edge of hearing. No words, just the hiss of thoughts scraping against his mind. Shapes slithered through the dark, eyes blooming into existence only to melt away. Each pair drilling into him with something that was not curiosity, but verdict. The whispers thickened into voices that clawed at the edges of his mind. He couldn't translate the words, but the truth behind them rammed straight through his soul. Do not look. The chronarch shrieked as his mind was flung back into flesh, his vision snapping into the sterile glow of the Nixian Spears lab. He lay sprawled on the cold alloy deck, breath ragged and stuttering. Around him, his crew lay scattered like broken dolls, eyes frozen wide, mouths twisted in the shapes of screams that would never reach air. The eclipse did nothing more. No weapon fire, no pursuit, no threats. It simply turned away, drifting back to its patrol lane like the Nixian spear had never existed at all, like the curiosity of lesser minds was beneath its regard. By the time scavenger drones found the drifting hulk of a Nixian spear weeks later, no one remained to speak of what had happened. Its databanks were scorched, records scrambled into static. The High Synod tried to crush the scandal under layers of denial, erasing every mention of Operation Obsidian Veil. But rumor always finds cracks to seep through. Whispers clawed their way through trade ports and back-channel forums. Never peer inside a Terran warship. Some truths were carved for the dark alone. What the Ziranai endured detonated through the Ascendant like a silent bomb. If even the mind-shapers, architects of probability and space-time, could not grasp the secret that pulsed at the core of Terran hulls, then maybe, just maybe, that secret was not for any living thing to hold. Fear ossified into hush. Hush into deliberate blindness. For decades after, no species dared to tune their arrays toward a human prowler in the dark. Encounters with the Terran Navy shrank to ghost glances. Alien ships quietly peeling off their trajectory the instant a black hull winked on their scopes. The Dominion, so smug in its universal index of every living race, discreetly pruned humanity from its codices. But in every darkened lab and dusty archive, a few minds still couldn't let the riddle die. The Drelai Collective, historians, lore keepers, eternal diggers through the wreckage of what was lost. They were not conquerors, nor were they foolish enough to crave dominion. They just wanted to know. For them, the Terran puzzle was the brightest spark in the galactic night. And so they broke the pact of silence. They called it the Shadow Thread, a lone Drelai scout crawler. The Curiosity's bounty slinked to the coal behind a Terran patrol phalanx. They had no intention of brute-forcing a scan. No probes, no deep phase spikes. Only passive recordings of formation shifts, drive wakes, energy flickers. If they could just find a pattern, a heartbeat of reason behind the madness, they would glimpse the shape of the terror. For weeks they clung to the edges of shadows. The Terran flotilla never swerved, never chased them off, gave no hint that the Curiosity's bounty even existed. It almost made the Drelai believe the stories had been overblown. Until one day, without a single pulse of warning, the Terran flagship, the ISS Revenant, drifted to a dead halt. The rest of the black armored fleet glided on through the stars like nothing was amiss. But the Revenant just lingered, waiting, staring, and on the Drelai deck, a shiver crept through every soul who dared to wonder if the riddle they were chasing was now watching them back. Paused, confusion rippling across the bridge. They hadn't breached the hull with a scan, hadn't even brushed the ship's skin with an intrusive pulse. So, why did it feel in every bone of their bodies like the Revenant had turned its eye on them? Aboard the Curiosity's bounty, the air thickened into something suffocating. Captain Cathel, an old explorer who pried secrets from dead worlds and crawling gas giants alike, stood on the precipice of retreat. They'd gathered volumes of data. That alone was enough to crown this mission a triumph. But curiosity was the ember that drove the Drelai through every age. So, with a flicker of guilt dancing behind his eyes, Cathel spoke the words that would damn them. One passive sweep, just enough to learn why it waits. Obedient hands obeyed. The sensors bloomed outward like a breath, gentle, almost reverent. They were careful, like priests tiptoeing through a temple that might wake if disturbed. For a heartbeat, all was calm. Then the Curiosity's bounty convulsed as though an invisible fist had wrapped around its bones. Every screen winked out. Consoles burst like overripe fruit, showering sparks and acrid smoke. Gravity snapped. Up became down. Down became a killing field of falling bodies. The crew screamed as they were slammed into ceilings, then floors. And then the thoughts came, not through any comm line, but inside their skulls. Not words. Visions. Alien memories that did not belong to them. They saw a world set aflame by relentless iron storms. They felt hatred, ancient and bottomless, a black tide of wrath, so deep it drowned stars. They glimpsed shapes that cast shadows not made by any sun, but by something older than light itself. Cathil dropped to the deck, palms clamped around his skull, veins pulsing under skin ready to split. Around him, his crew wept, raving half-words that scraped their throats raw, nonsense fragments about watchers in the abyss. Amid that chorus of agony came a single voice, vast, echoing, older than some of their fragile years. It was not human, but it spoke with a fury forged in humanity's darkest crucibles. You were warned. Then silence fell like a blade. Days later, the Curiosity's bounty drifted across the threshold into neutral void, floating aimlessly on the current of its own inertia. Every soul aboard was found alive, but none untouched. Cathil, once the mind that mapped the forgotten arteries of lost empires, never spoke again. He simply stared, eyes hollow pits reflecting horrors no one could name. The others babbled tangled threads of madness, half-dreamed tales of ascensions waiting behind every Terran hull, a force so vast that even the Dominion had buried its name. The Drelai High Circle crushed the incident beneath layers of sealed records and ritual silence. And so, the last people brave enough to chase the riddle took their place beside the rest of the galaxy, an unspoken, final pact forged in terror. No one, no matter how clever or reckless or ancient, would ever pierce the skin of a Terran ship again, not out of fear for humankind, but for what humankind had unearthed in the dark. Across the spiral arms, that quiet vow held fast, a hush that wrapped every starport and listening post. It never made it into textbooks, but every pilot, every scholar, every archivist knew. Some secrets are not meant to be cut open, so no eyes turned where the black holes drifted. No arrays reached for them, not the enlightened ones, not the predator kings, not even the fools who'd once worn curiosity as a crown. And yet, somewhere in the crawling dark between stars, there are always those who can't stop themselves from asking, what really watches back? Always the ones who couldn't help themselves, who heard every ghost story as an invitation. The Serkari were that sort. Unlike the Ziranai who tried to cage forbidden truths, or the Drelai who'd hungered to understand, the Serkari were merchants of shadows, smugglers, data raiders, black archive kings. In their eyes, secrets weren't mysteries to protect. They were the ultimate coin. So when the rumors of Terran ships reached their underworld dens, how the Dominion fell quiet, how the boldest minds returned hollowed out, they didn't recoil. They leaned closer, deep in the derelict lanes of uncharted void, where no patrols wandered and no treaties mattered. The Serkari built their snare, a lifeless star system, a fake SOS on an old trade channel, and a gutted freighter packed with hidden arrays tuned to pierce any veil. The plan was elegance itself. Bait a Terran vessel in, light the scanners, dump every scrap of data into a black relay station before the Navy knew they were there. Information was worth empires. Some rich fool would buy the forbidden truth for 10 lifetimes of credits. Krellin, the spider at the heart of this web, ruled the op. He wasn't green. He'd heard the tavern whispers, the stories of minds fried by shadows, ships that looked back. But ghosts were for children. Weak minds panic, he told his crew. We deal in reality. We deal in profit. We'll look and we'll see the truth. So the trap yawned open. The decoy signal drifted. Perfect bait. And the humans came. A lone Terran hunter, the ISS Revenant, blinked out of hyperspace, gliding to the debris field like a shark among minnows. It was no dread beast, no planet killer out of nightmare ballads. Just a lean destroyer, its hull dark and quiet. But from the moment Krellin glimpsed its silhouette, something burrowed under his skin, an inch behind his heart that whispered, "Turn back." He spat it out like poison. "Run the sweep," he ordered. Hesitation flickered in the eyes of his techs, but obedience won. Scanners powered up. Wave after wave brushed the Terran hull like curious fingers. No alarms. No screams. The screens purred with stable feeds. Krellin felt a grin crawl across his face. "See? All ghost stories. We have it now. The treasure, we..." Then he saw the readout. A blank slate. No thermal bleed. No dry bloom. No mass signature at all. In real space. That was impossible. Even the slyest stealth skin leaked gravity ripples. Even phantom cloaks left a fingerprint. Yet the Revenant read as nothing. Krellin got twisted around his spine. Understanding dawned like cold iron. The ship had allowed the scan. Not because they'd outsmarted the legend, but because the Revenant wanted to be seen. Its hull lights didn't flicker. The Circury's own consoles did. The gentle thrum of the freighter's old engines began to stutter, coughing like a dying animal. Krellin clutched the edge of his command console as the air thickened like poison syrup. Every breath scraped his lungs raw, like the atmosphere itself had turned against him. All around him, his crew staggered on trembling legs, some dropping to the deck as spasms rattled their bones. The ship was speaking, not with static, not with any comm line. It spoke in memory. Krellin's sight buckled. In an instant, the filthy, dim-lit bridge was gone. He stood in the husk of a world burned to the marrow. Charred cities, oceans boiled away, a fleet shattered into drifting iron carcasses. And the Terran dreadships overhead. They were never machines. Not truly. In the heart of humanity's darkest war, something old had cracked open. Something that should have died when the ash settled. But it clung on rootless, a scream that could not find its grave. When the last human shipwrights built their iron juggernauts, they did not craft ships. They forged coffins. And something inside never stopped wailing. The vision tore him out like a fishhook through the skull. Krellin collapsed to the deck, while burning his throat as he vomited up what felt like pieces of his own mind. He clawed at the nearest panel, nails splintering, trying to shut down the uplink, to shred every trace of the stolen feed. But it was far too late. The Revenant moved, not with thrusters, not through any maneuver known to physics. It simply flickered. One heartbeat it loomed off the bow. The next it bled through the Circury ship's walls. Bulkheads wept black code. Consoles screamed static. Crew shrieked as their eyes blackened over, limbs rigid, mouths gaping open but no sound came out. Krellin watched through a haze of searing agony as numbers blinked across his console, a final readout. Data transfer complete. The precious truth they clawed out of the void, the secret they thought would make them kings. Gone, fired into some dark corridor of the network. Where they'd gone, he'd never know, and he'd never tell. The Revenant spoke once more, a whisper that dripped into the hollow pit of his skull. "Your debt is paid." Then, like the echo of a dying star, it vanished. No ship, no Circury crew, no drifting ruin. Just silence. The stolen knowledge, the scrap of forbidden code that cost him everything, was never recovered. But in the dark gutters of forgotten systems, where ancient war hulks drifted like tombstones, some began to stir. And this hush that fell across the spiral arms was different than before. Once, species turned away from Terran dreadships because they feared the screaming unknown. Now, they turned away because they understood. In their bones, they grasped that something old and furious had been nudged awake. A thing not meant for any star map. For centuries, the Ascended Dominion had imagined itself the apex mind of the galaxy, a crown atop a cosmos charted and tamed. They'd etched the stars into ledgers, indexed every species, raised empires that span light years. But there are shadows in the void no archive can pin down, shapes that devour anyone who tries to speak their names. The forgotten war, the scattered fragments. And now, across buried archives and sealed vaults, the last forbidden whispers have begun to weave together. That humanity's greatest war had not been waged against a rival empire, but against something other, short, brutal. The Terrans had stood alone in the dark. No allies, no declarations of mutual defense. And then, like a candle pinched out, it ended. Humanity emerged from the ashes. But no soul ever spoke clearly of what they'd survived. At first, the Dominion's archivists assumed the obvious. The humans had obliterated their foes so completely that time itself forgot. But the scraps hinted at a truth far more terrifying. The whispering hulls, the rumor ships. After the Cesari vanished, the pattern shifted, subtle at first. Terran dreadnoughts began appearing where no flight logs showed they jumped. Some drifted to the ghost fields of ancient wars that never officially happened. A few were glimpsed hanging above dead worlds, watching tomb cities, their gun arrays humming but never unleashed. And then came the whispers. Freight haulers, station techs, drifters skimming the black market lanes. They all spoke of the same flicker. Mid-flight, their instruments would hiccup. A pulse of static through the comms, a flicker across nav screens. Not a distress call, not a threat, a presence. Not words, not clear thoughts, just a knowing that something ancient had looked back at them for a moment and remembered. Most just shut it off. A few lost their nerve completely, abandoning ships to drift dead in the void. But some, the oldest mercenaries, the hard-eyed ones who carve out empires with plasma and steel, they felt the shape of it. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. A low growl from a cage door they prayed would stay locked. Quietly, these warriors began to slip away. They laid down banners they'd carried for decades. They deserted fleets that would have crowned them kings. Some vanished into remote exile, not because they feared Terran guns, but because they feared whatever nightmare the Terrans had welded into steel coffins and called ships. In the halls of the Ascendant Dominion, an emergency conclave was called. They pored over the broken reports, the half-legends, the final flickers of the Cesari's last transmission. The patter was clear enough to chill them to the marrow. The humans hadn't won that old war by erasing an enemy. They'd sealed it inside, and now a piece of it had slipped loose, transmitted through data that should never have existed. The Cesari signal had been loosed on the void. No one could say who caught it, only that someone, somewhere, now held a shard of the horror. So the Dominion did what they'd never done before. They signed the first sealed order, a vow inked in dread and enforced with blade and fire. No species, no fleet, no shadow cabal, no genius lone archivist would ever probe a Terran hull again. Any mind foolish enough to try would be erased not by the humans, but by the Dominion's own hand. Because some monsters thrive on curiosity, and if that cage thing ever woke fully, no fleet in the stars could choke it back down. In a dead corner of the spiral arm, where no chart named the place and no patrol came near, an abandoned outpost flickered back to life. A single console, dark for years, spat out the last ghostly fragments of the Cesari stolen code. And somewhere beyond that blinking screen, in the hollows of a warship's iron bones, something ancient and furious stirred, waiting for someone else to ask the question. They were warned never to speak aloud be why the Serkari, now decrypted at last. On the flickering console, the cracked screen displayed only a single thing: coordinates. And far beyond the rim, in that hush where no suns dared shine, something that should have slumbered forever opened its unseen eyes. Those numbers pointed to a place that logic refused to name, a sector scrubbed from every Dominion chart, a sliver of dark so absolute that even the boldest survey drones turned to drifting junk the moment they crossed its line. Sensors failed there. Engines flickered out for no reason. The Conquered had buried this abyss centuries ago, stitched over it with layers of silence. But now, Something had dragged it back from the grave. A lone vessel, lean, nameless, drifted through that breathless dark. No beacon codes. No registry marks. A patchwork ghost assembled from stolen hull plates and black market salvage, piloted by the sort of mind that should have known better. Inside its tight metal throat sat one soul, Vaya. For 10 years she'd chased rumors like fireflies through black water. The fall of the Serkeri, the whispers that bled to the void, the warship phantoms that slipped between starfields like ghosts. It all pointed here. She knew the old stories. The Dominion's first sealed order. The unwritten law that even pirates and warlords obeyed. Don't look. But Vaya had never cared for fear. Knowledge was the ember that burned her alive, and she would feed it anything, even her own sanity. So her ragged vessel slid closer to the forbidden mark. The screens fizzed ecstatic. The engines coughed once and died. The grav plates flickered under her boots. It was as if the darkness itself refused her passage, the void flexing like a living throat around a bone it wouldn't swallow. Vaya hissed a breath between her teeth, fingers darting over manual overrides. And then she saw it. At first it was only a smear of deeper shadow. Then her eyes grasped a shape, not a ship, a mausoleum, vast, larger than any dreadnought from Terran ghost stories. A drifting city built not for war, but for some kind of terrible burial. It hung dead in space, engines long cold, lights forever snuffed. But its presence pressed into Vaya's skull, a psychic bruise, fingernails dragging across the roots of her mind. All her years she told herself warships were just steel, circuits, propulsion. But this wasn't a machine. This was a corpse. And inside that corpse, something refused to die. Her pulse skipped and stuttered, but she forced her hand steady. One scan. Just one. And she'd have the truth no archivist, no Dominion lord, no trembling mercenary ever dare to keep. The scanners croaked awake. Data poured across the displays, and her breath caught. This thing wasn't forged for humans. It was forged from them. Not just alloys and ancient human schematics. Flesh, veins of something organic threaded the iron ribs. Sections pulsed softly, like a giant taking shallow breaths in its endless sleep. Then the feed spasmed. Words bled down the screen, sentences flickering between languages not spoken by any known tongue. Symbols shifting, reshaping. And beneath that hissed a sound, not through her comms, but inside her bones comms, no deeper. Inside her skull, a whisper, ancient and hollow as a grave dug in space. You have seen too much. Vaya choked on a cry, stumbling backward as her vision splintered like shattered glass. Flashes lashed through her mind. A war no archive remembered, whole fleets flaring like dying suns, planets howling in agony. A monstrous mistake. And then the thing humanity had built to bury it. The first dreadships, not war machines, but coffins, vaults, living cages for a terror that could never be named. Humanity had not survived their war. They'd simply buried it. Locked inside these rotting giants of metal and pulsing bone, weapons forged not to kill but to contain. And now, because of her, because the Serkeri had dared, because too many fools ignored the warnings, one was stirring. Her breath turned ragged. She lurched for the escape pod, each step echoing with a distant, hungry chorus. Her ship wasn't just dying. It was being eaten from within. Something in that vast cadaver had smelled her mind and wanted more. She slammed her palm against the pod's hatch just as the bulkhead behind her crumpled inward. Not burnt, not breached, but unraveled, like paper in a storm. The pod launched, tearing free as her stolen ship dissolved into the dark. For one final moment, through the tiny viewport, Vaya glimpsed the dreadship's carcass twitch, its dead hull flickering with a sickly pulse. A heartbeat. It was waking, and the void would never sleep again. The pod tumbled through the deep, spinning like a stone tossed into endless black. Its system sparked and hiccuped, half dead, like her thoughts. Vaya's chest heaved. The secret she'd torn from the abyss throbbed behind her eyes, a knowledge no mind should carry. She had found the truth. She had freed it, Now it would not stop with her. Weak fingers danced across the pod's battered console. The comms relay coughed to life, static and fizz, but enough. She keyed in a simple burst, a final plea that would skitter across the stars to anyone still listening. 3 words. Just 3. It is awake. The message flared through the dark like an ember in dry grass. The Dominion panicked. Whole fleets ignited from nowhere, scouring their own archives, clawing for ancient defenses. Emergency councils whispered and argued in marble chambers far from the dying edge. And humanity? They said nothing. No warning. No denial. No vow of comfort. The old dread ships, the Iron Guardians drifting in silence for centuries, they stirred. One by one, they turned, aligning toward a single coordinate, the tomb Vaya had uncovered. Across every fringe outpost, every deep space barge, every hidden archive vault, the truth sank in like poison. The Terran ships had never been weapons. They had been wardens. And now, what they had locked away was waking up to finish what their dead creators had begun. Vaya never made it home. Days later, scavengers found her pod adrift near the Dominion's edge. No hull breach, no claw marks, just empty. Only the logs remained, that same ghost message looping endlessly, a final echo in the galactic dark. It is awake. By then, it no longer mattered. Far out where no star's light dared reach, something vast and furious shivered back into motion. The Lost War had never truly ended. It had merely dreamed. And now, at last, it was time to finish what humanity had so desperately tried to bury. If this story sent a chill down your spine, imagine what's still waiting in the dark. Hit that like button if you dare. Subscribe for more forbidden tales from the void, and tell me in the comments, would you risk scanning a Terran warship? Until next time, keep your sensors off and your eyes open.